Dasalia yo lea nispo ni lea abomo chenmo kwe chu skula tang ma pa kyong se le bomo chenmo la ni kwe chu skula tang lea dukse ya no skula chele lea dukse yo ngari bomo chungse a cheno mo niska a chile chu ni yo le ta jing chu ta ni balang ti na jing chu che ti ni gari chi ke shole yon se balang ma chi le skit potaminu pale ya men no tanga du gozare công sang mà yang sĩ can song công sung kula thu tang cha sung yang man được panok le kit potarak pale yang kon sukula sukul yalba ta zire diga bor banok le kon sukula rule ya sukul yalba chale ta zire kherak le
daksange ngata de yargias panangyampo nyampo changma ngata skula ta no galale skula ta nanyampo teni demba na te mingunika chanspa jeskanzo yanga ta ningje jescheso yanga ta choso teni nyungje sonseno yali jezena mama ngata kitab silches mama samches nga doctor gyurgo sherak engineer gyurgo sherak halale tebo samches mini te ngata chichok sina michik na chiga ngata yato choches na roh choches na tene de singje choches bo nyunga chenso.
Through our kind of cultural myopia, we sort of think that we educate our kids, we send our kids to school, we have a form of enculturating kids into our society, which is education. And peoples who don't mimic those same patterns of education somehow don't educate their kids. Well, of course, that is absurd.
Chos na chok se ya de ta yontan zera na nya po ha nga chenmo song pe pene khop jin Teninge Bangla chenmo gyabin nge zuko gadi shuli nge gadi na yontani zakse zuko khurang tontak khurang sose gyursong tamana ki pene choches la yontan choa zoshigale.
Today, Western schooling is responsible for introducing a human monoculture across the entire world. Essentially, the same curriculum is being taught, and it's training people for jobs, very scarce jobs, but for jobs in an urban consumer culture. The diversity of cultures, as well as the diversity of unique human individuals, is being destroyed in this way.
This particular school that was established, called the Moravian Mission School, was secular in the sense that, of course, some Christian teaching was given as a part of an evangelistic outreach by the Moravians. In 1887, when the school first started, there were certain perceptions that were wrong. For example, a school started by the missionaries on a street corner must have an ulterior motive of conversion, of teachings that are in conflict with the teachings of the traditional society or the religion.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
And I've been told that the children had to come by force to the school. They wouldn't like to. People just wouldn't send children to the school.
And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us.
I strongly believe that a secular education system and a cosmopolitan school society should not be at the expense of losing Ladakhiness.
And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
If you have lost your history, you have lost everything.
You know, the great lesson of anthropology is the idea that the world into which you were born doesn't exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one particular set of adaptive choices that your lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. And the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you, or in our case, failed attempts at modernity. They are by definition unique facets of the human imagination, and when asked the meaning of being human, they respond with 6,000 different voices, and those voices collectively become the human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us in the ensuing millennia. You know, we always have this this idea of our society as not being really a culture, but being the real world, and these other cultures are outside. Those are the cultures. But that kind of cultural myopia we really can no longer afford. And you know, we aren't the real inexorable wave of history. We're just another set of possibilities. We're just another cultural reality with choices that we've made. And that's why in the whole realm of child rearing and education, I think it behooves us to look at models of enculturation, of initiation, of bringing children to the realm of adulthood that other societies have celebrated and developed over thousands of years of experience.
There is no doubt that if we look honestly at the traditional forms of education and compare them to today's modern education system, that the traditional forms of knowledge fostered sustainability. All these cultures were not perfect, but they did know about their own specific climate, soil, water, and they did manage to survive independently, in charge of their own lives, for generation after generation. In the modern economy and with the modern educational system, the children learn nothing about that, but instead they learn how to use essentially corporate products in an urban consumer culture. So once they've been educated in modern schools, they literally don't know how to survive in their own environment.
Education is not simply the transmission of information. It's by definition the transmission and indeed the enculturation, or one could say more harshly, the indoctrination of a child into a certain way of knowing, a way of learning, a way of being. And again, when we project our notions of what education is or what a way of being is overseas into other people's lives, we forget that we're projecting just something that we made up, right? And one of the things that I see in my work is that different ways of knowing, different ways of being, different ways of learning really create different human beings. If you're raised in Colorado to believe that a mountain is an inert pile of rock waiting to be mined, you're going to have a very different relationship to that mountain from a kid from southern Peru who believes in the fiber of his being that a mountain is an Apu spirit, a protective deity that will direct his destiny throughout life. Now, the interesting observation is not whether that mountain is in fact a spirit or whether it's just a pile of dirt. The interesting observation is how the education system into what that mountain is creates a different human being with a different relationship to the earth. I was raised in the forests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the ideology of scientific forestry that I was taught in school and that I practiced as a logger in the woods. It was based on the idea that we had to eliminate all the old growth to get some healthy plantations growing in their wake, because after all, the incremental addition of cellulose would be higher in a plant. I mean, but this was a construct. But critically, that belief system made me a very different human being with a very different relationship to that forest than my friends from native communities who believed that that forest was the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven. Because of my ideology, my education, those forests no longer exist.
I think the way Western education has grown over the last few centuries, especially with the rise of industrialization, was basically not to create human beings fully equipped to deal with life and all its problems, independent citizens, able to exercise their decisions and live their responsibilities in community, but elements to feed into an industrial production system. They were products with partial knowledge. We moved from wisdom to knowledge, and now we are moving from knowledge to information, and that information is so partial that we are creating incomplete human beings.
If we look back at the beginning of so-called education, the agenda was very clear. There was an elite that wanted to train people to serve their needs, to essentially create an extractive economy that served the few at the expense of the many. So there's very explicit literature. Very clearly education was there to train a class of people to serve the needs of the elite.
When Macaulay came to India, I don't know how many of you know, but Macaulay was the guy who created in the minutes of Macaulay, it's called Macaulay's Children. And Macaulay's children, he said, would be brown on the outside but white on the inside. That they would basically know only one thing, how to rule India as if they were Europeans themselves.
So if you go back to the 60s and you look at a lot of the modernization literature, so it's very clearly written that local language, local tradition, local customs is a barrier to modernization, and for communities to progress in kind of stages of development, these things need to be eliminated.
99% of all the activities that go under the label of education come from this very specific agenda that grew out of a colonial expansion across the world by Europeans. And now in different countries in the so-called third world, the basic fundamental agenda is the same, is to pull people into dependence on a modern centralized economy, is to pull them away from their independence and from their own culture and self-respect.